We are going through Vacation Bible School themes on Sunday morning, and I don't think I have to convince you much. We have this whole set here, and we're about to start on Monday morning. And it's good for us to go over the same material as the kids sometimes, because they come home with all this material. They came home with the songs, which I listened to over and over and over. Thank you for those CDs, over and over and over again. And it's good for us to understand where they're heading, where they're going, what the message is for us. And where we've come to this morning is perseverance, something we want to teach our children as early as possible, but it's a message we never really want to hear, because we really don't like being, I guess, in trouble, always fighting, always dealing with resistance, having to engage in oppression. It's not a fond memory for us. And so there's never really a good time to talk about perseverance. You know, telling you stories about overcoming adversity. And one of those times I think is funny. I'd like to show you a movie clip here in just a second about a time where someone tried to coach someone through a difficult time while they were in the midst of it. It's always a tough thing to try and hear these encouraging words. And this is from the legend of Bagger Vance, where Jonah is coming back after traumatic war experience, and he's trying to fit back in with society, and they kind of trick him into doing this golf match. And he's struggling to try and perform. He's struggling to be he used to be. And you have Bagger Vance trying to coach him through this perseverance. So let's take a look.
I had me an uncle named Rufus. Lost his right arm in a cotton gin. Learned how to do everything with his left arm. Eddie Shelley, he was changing the wheel on a wagon. Axle snapped, chopped off his left arm, so he learned how to do everything with his teeth.
It was a mistake.
One night he said some things to Mr. Johnny he shouldn't have said. Mr. Johnny, knock all the teeth out his head.
Savannah's own.
So he learned how to do everything with his feet. Oh, tell he got this fungus. It grew all up the socket. I'm trying to tell you a story about overcoming adversity.
Listen, you want to talk to me about my grip? Fine. Talk to me about my swing? Fine.
You don't want to hear about the fungus? He became a dancer. Oh, he made a fortune. It was the most amazing thing to see this armless, toothless man sliding back and forth across the stage to the music of Bessie Smith and the Duke.
I don't care if I'm 12 strokes back. I just don't.
You don't even want to win?
It's just a game, Bagger.
Yes, sir. You done said it yourself now. That's a game. So maybe there's something else that's riling you. Maybe you thought you was just going to sashay out onto that green and the old hero of Savannah just reappeared all by itself. Don't work that way is all. The junior you was, you ain't never going to be again. Ever. That's all I'm saying.
You don't know a damn thing about me.
Well, I know one thing for sure. You gonna look pretty foolish tromping out there with two different shoes on your feet.
Oh, Jesus. You got an answer for everything, don't you, Bagger? Let me tell you something. There's no difference between winning and losing, and anything in between. What's lost is lost. A man lives, a man dies. And in the end, it all turns out the same. You're alone. And that's all you're ever gonna be.
That a fact. Alone. So a soul is born with everything that the Lord can give it, and things don't go its way, so it just gives up, and the good Lord just takes everything back.
That's right.
And then the soul dies alone. But that's pretty much what you said?
That's right.
That's a sad story, Mr. Junior.
Yes, it is.
And that's about the dumbest thing I heard any fool say ever. You got yourself a hard eye there, Mr. Jenner. Soul is born with everything, don't look dies, and the good Lord. You a funny man, Mr. Jenner.
Definitely not the right time, maybe. But, we never really are in a position to take that advice, especially when we're in the midst of trouble. Hearing a story about overcoming difficulty, I don't want to hear that right now. Well, that's what we're going to cover today. And we're going to look at it through Nehemiah. I cannot remember the last time Nehemiah was mentioned in a sermon, do you? And so I suppose we would have learned a little something about Nehemiah before we continue along. We heard about it just earlier through the scriptures that he rebuilt these walls, and what was that all about? Well, here's the deal with Nehemiah. As we look at how Christians can make it through perseverance, we can take a look at him. This was a time, a very low time for the Jewish people, for the Hebrew people. It's still a low time for them, if you ask me. Their peak was Solomon and all of his glory, and they're just coming off of this. And they had sinned after being all this great nation and finally had the promised land. They sinned. And eventually other countries came in, other powers came in and took over them because they lost their way of God. The Persian government came in and destroyed the northern kingdoms, and then later on the Babylonians would come in and take the rest. And as of right now, as of Nehemiah's time, the Babylonians were ruling everything. And they all had a habit of destroying every religious artifact, destroying the walls, destroying the armies, and scattering them to the corners. And so the Jewish people were in exile. They were scattered everywhere. Some tribes to be lost forever, just destroyed because of their disobedience. And it is at this time with Nehemiah where one word can describe where we're at: restoration. Nehemiah is moving to bring the people back, and that by God's hand. Could you go back to that map? You'll see that up there. This is Jerusalem back in this time, not quite as big as we envision it, you know. This was kind of a smaller place, and just 20 years before Nehemiah, the king at the time was allowing the Jewish people to go back to the area where they were from. And when they got there, they restored the temple, which is at the top, that would be the top right-hand side to you. They reestablished the temple floor. They put the altar back in place. But all those walls that you see around there were still burned. They were broken. They were scattered all over the place. So if you were a raiding army, even a little skirmish could cause all that to be destroyed again. And so the people cried out to God and then to Nehemiah, please help us. Nehemiah was a high official. He was the cupbearer to the king. And I suppose if you want a king's ear, you bring him alcohol. And that was his job. He brought wine to the king. And so he was seen as a high official. He was a great individual, and the king really admired and lifted him up. He honored Nehemiah. And so one day, Nehemiah heard this plea. And we get to our first point today. We can, if you want to skip along there, we can as Christians take action in difficult times, just like Nehemiah, and this through prayer and planning. We have to go to our knees. If you are dealing with difficult times right now, resistance, if bad things have happened in your life, if you're not praying, it will be worse for you. I don't know how else to say it. Prayer does not guarantee your plan will come out the way you have designed. But prayer. God is listening. And through prayer, God is molding you. When we are in the midst of it, we go to God. Because you will be in the midst of it eventually. That is the one thing this world can promise. Tragedy, difficulty. And so we go to God in prayer, and we see Nehemiah showing us this. Let's take a look at chapter 1 here. So after Nehemiah heard this plea, then we catch up with him, and the I is Nehemiah talking to us. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. This is a man deeply troubled by what's happening, and he knows what God is asking him to do. It's a big thing to ask, to go before a king and ask to rebuild the fortified walls of their city. This is something a foreign occupation army does not allow. And he's about to go before the king to do this. He knew this. And where did he go first? Where did Nehemiah go first? And if you look at all the great men of the Bible and the women of the Bible, when you look at what Jesus did when he was about to face adversity, where did he go first? To his knees. He went before the Lord in prayer. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven for days. And I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commands, let your ear be attentive and your eye upon me. Hear me. Now, prayer is less about us changing God's mind and a whole lot about him changing us. Through prayer, we are molded and we begin to understand a plan. Now, that does not mean that God puts you in this position in order to teach you something. We normally get ourselves in our own fixes. We don't need God's help to get our heads stuck between a couple of rails. But we need his help to get out. And so Nehemiah is before God, asking him, please listen, conform me. And it wasn't much longer after this prayer that a plan began to emerge, and Nehemiah began to see, but he was still afraid. Because where did he have to go? He had to go to the king and jeopardize his status, jeopardize everything, and ask him, this occupying force, this foreign king, to let him go back to their capital city and rebuild the fortified walls. That is a military issue. That's not talking about the temple anymore. He's asking to fortify the city against invasion, and that's pretty much going to be the Babylonians. And so we read on how this plan began to develop through prayer, and now he's going before the king to ask this big question. And he asks, and this is how the king responds. And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone, and when will you return? What's the king asking for? What's he asking for? The plan. I mean, God is not some random God who just, oh, you know what, let's just go do this now. God has a plan. He understands and sees all, and for us to understand that plan is part of the key to overcoming difficult times. We go to our knees before the God who has a plan. Changes us, and then when you go before kings, that plan will be accepted, or at least we'll find out how. So how long will you be gone, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors in the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judea, and a letter to the keeper of the king's force, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple. Get it? Fortress? I mean, he's laying it down there. I'm going to build a fortress. I'm going to keep you out in the end, but I'm going to build a fortress. This is gutsy. This is goosebump. I mean, this is a little bit of courage coming out here. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. The plan that God had delivered to Nehemiah was taking shape, and that through prayer. I think it's funny, just earlier, he goes and the king asks him, so what do you want? And he goes to prayer and says, dear Lord, please be with me, please be with me, mumbling in the background, and then he asks, this is an afraid man, knowing that this is a big thing. But we learn these lessons in the Old Testament. We really do. We learn these lessons. Just Joshua, just an eon back, it seems like, when they were conquering the promised land, Joshua was knocking in his boots. He was shaking. And God said, hey, this is the plan. And this is what he said to Joshua. Have I not commanded you to do this, Joshua? Have I not told you to do this? Remember who I am. You think life here is hard now? Well, remember who you're going to. I am God. I am King. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So Jeremiah, through prayer and planning, attacked the difficult parts of his life. But of course, any new idea can be difficult to digest. There's one thing I've learned over time. When I was younger, I was always afraid of someone stealing my new ideas, like they were great to begin with. Because some of them are very new and novel. And then I realized as I got older and I worked with people, if they're truly new and innovative, people will run from them. No one's trying to steal them. No one likes change. If they're truly new and different, they will run from them. And so we have Joshua with this idea given to him by God through the calling of the people. And boy, this is where our second point comes to life. Christians deal with problems and plots through trust and help. We have to trust that God will be there for us, just as he commanded Joshua. I'm going to be there. Hang in there. I got you. Just like he commanded Nehemiah, go do this. And he got to go before the king. And just because the king said, yes, go do it, didn't mean the trouble was over. It was just beginning. There are going to be plots made against Nehemiah's life. The kings and the generals of the area around Jerusalem, they hate the king's idea. And they're going to send soldiers at night to kill the workers. It'll be dark. It'll take forever for communication to get back to the king. We'll just deny it ever happened. So they're planning to do these night raids to kill the workers building the walls. Just because God said go do it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Just because the king said, yeah, here's some letters, go get them, tiger, doesn't mean everything's going to go without resistance. This was going to be hard. And so we can look at Nehemiah and see exactly how he dealt with this. With trust and with some help. So we look at this. We hear this opposition to the work, and these generals are going to send these raids out. And so where does he go first? Always? Where does Nehemiah go? What's the plan, God? He goes back to prayer. So, chapter 4, verse 4. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Whenever you change things, there's always someone. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. He goes right to God and says, hey, these people are causing problems. Bring the wrath on them and save me, Pray for me and thank God. So he goes back in prayer. And this is what God does. He gives Nehemiah a thought. Nehemiah, maybe you can't do this alone. Moses, father-in-law, Moses, you can't do this alone. Joshua, you can't do this alone. I can just keep going on and on and on. God has cursed us and blessed us with something. It's called delegation. We have to depend on someone else to help us accomplish what we need to get done. It's a terrible thing and it's a great thing. Working with people is hard. It's hard. I can bring up the jokes like, ask my wife. Working with people can be hard to accomplish a common goal. But God forces delegation into our lives. And so what happens is that he has a little courage, goes before God, and then God says this and encourages him to do this. And so Nehemiah asks for help. And this is where we catch up with him in verse 12. At that time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, you must return to us. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in the open places, remember the walls, it's all open, in the open places, I stationed the people by their clan, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. What is he acting on? Trust God, right? We have help. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and is awesome. And fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your home. Hold your ground. And help came. We have to trust God in the midst of difficulty. It can be so hard, and I'm not going to pretend that it isn't. I don't like giving answers to people when bad things happen. All I know is that God is there and that he is with us, and we must trust, and that we cannot do it alone. One of the greatest tools of the devil is to separate you from the pack. Is to think that you're all alone in your troubles, that through your tragedy, through your difficulty, that you are all alone and no one is like you and no one's going to help you. And it's just like the gazelle being cut down by a cheetah. Separate you from the pack and then attack and attack. We need help. And so if you're in the midst of difficulty, if you're dealing with resistance, if life is hard, do not run away. Find a Christian. Find many Christians. Find a home of Christians. And do it together. That is what God is calling us to do. And so Nehemiah went to his knees and prayed during this difficult time, and he got a plan. And then when he was dealing with these problems and these plots, he trusted God, called out for help, and imparted that trust and courage to them. And they stood together, fighting for this plan, this cause. But in the end, Nehemiah had to do something. In the end, even with all these plans, even with the courage, he had to get off his rump and go to work. He had to act. And so we get to our third point. For Christians to endure long-term struggles and persevere, we must live it out. We must be a personal example. We must live through the spiritual principles, the spiritual disciplines. We don't preach about that a lot, but it's the truth. Nehemiah had to do what God asked him to do. God uses humanity for humanity. It is to his folly and our benefit, I guess. God delegates to us, too. And so Nehemiah began to live it out. And it wasn't easy. How do you build municipal projects? Who do they tax to build streets here? Everyone should know this that owns a house. They tax you to build your roads. Everyone wants nice roads. Nobody wants to pay. So if you're going to have a massive wall project in Jerusalem, who are the governors going to tax? They're going to tax the people around it. And eventually they had taxed them so hard, and these weren't just foreign leaders, these were the Jewish nobles. They are taxing the people so hard that they went broke and stole their land, took their land away, foreclosed on their land, and left them destitute. And they went crying to Nehemiah saying, "What is going on here? This was supposed to be a benefit to us, a calling of God, and you're breaking us. You're breaking our back." And Nehemiah was furious. He was very angry at the great outcry that these nobles were taxing the people into poverty. And he got on those nobles. Oh my goodness, I'm not going to read the whole thing. He got on those nobles and just grilled them. And then they were done. They were wet and sweaty. And they said, "You're right." And they gave the people back their land and cut the tax down to a minimum. And Nehemiah asked this of them because they knew one thing about Nehemiah. He never took a dime from his subjects. He lived by example. We read in 5:14. As Nehemiah explains, "Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judea, from the 12th year to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, 12 years neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. I never stole from the people. I never overtaxed. I found my way." Nehemiah lived by example, and so he could look at the nobles, look in their eyes, and say, "Don't you dare." And they went, "You're right." Why? Because Nehemiah was living it out. And that speaks volumes here. Just volumes. Well, this didn't make everyone happy, you can imagine. So he's coming and building this fortified city. The generals are trying to kill him. The people are being taxed to death. This is not a popular man. And so the generals come back again. Well, maybe we can trick one of these overtaxed people into giving Nehemiah over. And so they came up with a plan to assassinate Nehemiah. If you want to kill the dragon, cut the head off. And so they're going to get Nehemiah trapped. And so they send someone, one of the nobles, to Nehemiah, because the nobles weren't too happy about what he told them to do. And so one of the nobles went to Nehemiah and said, "They're coming to kill you tonight. Let's go to the temple, lock the doors so they can't get in. Let's go run and hide. That way, you don't have to worry about it. You'll live till tomorrow." All right. This is what Nehemiah said. "But I said, should a man such as I run away? And what man such as I could get into the temple and live anyway? I'm no saint. I have no business being in the temple. I will not go in." I will not go in. And this is what he found out later. Because he lived it out, because he stuck by his people, because he followed God's plan, this is what he found out later. And I understood and saw that God had not sent him, but he had pronounced the prophecy against me because 2 of the generals had hired him. For this purpose he was hired, that I should be afraid and act in this way and sin, and so be afraid, and they could give me a bad name in order to taunt me and to trap him and to kill him. He wasn't worried about reputation, was he? He was following God's plan. He was living it out. And you know what? The walls got built. The walls got built, and God's plan was fulfilled. So why do you care? I mean, come on, this is Nehemiah. Who cares? This is about some old guy a long time ago. This is why we care. Because Jesus Christ said, you are going to have to deal with the same thing. You are going to have to deal with the same thing. This is Matthew chapter 10. And tell me this doesn't just scream out Nehemiah and many of the others. Matthew chapter 10, starting with the 16th verse. Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. When they deliver you over, do not be anxious or worry. A bit of courage, how you are to speak or what you are to say. For what you are to say will be given you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will raise against children and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. How do we endure? On our knees. We pray to God, and we are molded, and we are changed through prayer until the plan is laid before us. And with that plan, we learn to trust in God. And when we trust in God and we understand the plan, know that you cannot do it alone. You cannot do it alone. And you find other Christians to surround you, and you live out that plan for you and for the community. And then you go out and you do the plan. There are times where you're so sick and tired of Tuesday meetings that you just want something to happen. I don't care what we do, just do it. That is because action is required, and we have to live it out. There's a point where you don't want to hear the talk anymore. You want to live it out. And that's what God is calling us to do. Live it out with a bit of prayer, courage, and help. And so, let us pray to the Lord and ask for his advice.